Welcome to Varn Vlog. Today I was walking my dog and listening to the music of my mother. My mother died at the beginning of this year of colon cancer. And I always hated my mother's music, particularly Fleetwood Mac. She would listen to Rumors on a cassette tape over and over and over in the car, and when we would drive back and forth between the hospital and Augusta and where we lived when my mom remarried in Central Georgia. Going back and listening to Lindsey Buckingham's Never Going Back was in some ways an accidental symbolic moment. It's a hard song to play. It doesn't sound hard, but the finger picking that it requires is actually quite difficult, and the speed and tone in which it is normally played is really hard to replicate. But it is one of those pieces of music that is only showy if you know how to play music. It does not sound ostentatious. It's not like a finger tapping 80s hair metal solo or math rock from the aughts, which sounds as complicated as it is. It's not prog rock or ostentatious rap or the kind of syncopated beats of Dirty South in the aughts. I bring up all these frames of music because a lot of us live our life associated with media. And going back and listening to this song that my mother loved and that I grew up hating, spurred me to think about a lot of things. About the dialogic nature of the way we encounter the world, about the many voices and preferences that we all have in our head. And I, being my politics what it is, I've always thought that class is a primary setter of these things, both in your origins and the taste in which you grow up, your, to use a sociological term, habitus, the habits which you have, but also the way in which you appreciate them. Because, frankly, appreciation requires leisure, or at least time to develop into the appreciation, to understand the musicality, to understand the narrative patterns. But the lyrics, Never Going Back, really struck me. After all, one of my great contentions of the last 2 decades is most of what we wanted to do was go back. When creating something new seemed impossible or unrecognizable, instead of leaning into that discomfort, most of us, and there are 1,000 reasons why, from the way the algorithm rewards this, to the freezing of time, the loss of a lot of in-person communities which entertain themselves by innovation, the kludginess and complexity of the modern world, which most people can't grasp, except that their tiny little cog specialty, and the dependency that people have on various forms of technology to do things that used to be basic. These things create up space for you to do new things, but they also have a cost. And so it struck me today that a lot of us do want to go back, and we can't. And as we cannot, we get more and more sour. It's a path dependency, but the thing about path dependencies is we tend to give them so much weight on their ideological content. What ideas lead to you assuming other ideas? And these things do matter. They are kind of like thought technologies. Once you develop them certain ways, they're going to go certain ways. And they're somewhat predictable. But what I mean is something different and more than just the ideological genealogies which exist in our head, or the moral inclinations and intuitions that we have that we try to conflate with descriptives of the world. And I say descriptions and not descriptions because The fundamental foolishness of the pragmatist and the empiricist is that they assume that how they construct the world does not actually shape the norms which they can try to draw from their descriptions. Well, as I've said over and over again, you cannot conflate norms with descriptions. You also can't pull them apart entirely. They are things interfused, like the way logic is interfused with emotion. So listening to Lindsey Buckingham say never going back, it seemed like something to point out that maybe I can convince you to do. This is not to say we should live in a pastless world. The pastless world is a futureless one, doomed to repeat itself in cycles of this idea occurring to you and reinventing the wheel. The accumulation of dead knowledge lives in us. So we're confronted with the vapid politics of joy that we won't be fooled again, and yet we see so many people wanting to liquidate themselves knowingly into being fooled again, when the most likely outcome is, even if this person does win, they will be incredibly unpopular within 4 years. When you live in phantoms being fed to you by hallucinating algorithms, what do you think is going to happen? Stagnation. You have all the components of innovation, but in their sheer overwhelm and your inability to limit yourself, you can't do anything with it. The dialogic becomes overwhelming. It becomes a flood of voices. And the personal and political get conflated. And like the normative and descriptive, the personal and political are never truly separated, but they're also never exactly the same. And to make them the same, just like making the norms and the descriptions the same, is to hollow out both. So I think about never going back again. I don't want to repeat the last 4 to 8 years. One of the strange things about the current left cycle is it tends to move not on material conditions, although recessions or lack of thereof are always being spotted here or there, and they do matter. They do shape and push the large movements of politics. But when you don't have an obvious material crisis pushing politics, which people respond, and the response, by the way, is never as set in stone as Marxists with simple teleology want to believe. Oh, if we just accelerate things, people would have to rebel in the way that we think. No, they don't. And they don't. And we see it all the time. You have more than ample evidence for that. Similarly, constructing a Marxism out of everywhere just to redeploy and find the pure form and adopt is itself a form of the purity fetish that the people who are doing so are themselves critiquing. You don't live in that world, and neither do they. How they respond: frustration, externalization, right-wing movements from fear, or the need of money, or both. Never going back again. I've been thinking a lot about Mark Fisher, too, another ghost of my past. Fisher and I were not close. I never met him in person. We exchanged emails when I was in Mexico and Egypt. I worked with him on one article that kind of became famous after the fact. But it always amazed me how much of Fisher's context is removed from his brief works. After all, capitalist realism is mostly a piece of art criticism. If you don't believe me, look at how much it focuses on movies. Ghost of My Life is almost auto theory and haunted by the fact that Fisher was not going to make it from the very things he was writing about. The inability to separate the private and the public, the personal and political, was profound for him. And in many ways, he thought the politics of joy, for him too, found in Corbyn, not Harris, would save him. He is dead. I mourn him. I miss him. I wish I'd gotten a chance to know him better. I worked at the imprint he co-founded, although after he left over there at Zero Books, most people know that was my brief foray into fame. Otherwise, I'd be an obscure poet. But he's a figure, a ghost of my life, and a ghost that in some ways I've wished to excise. I wouldn't criticize him for years out of affection for a dead friend, similar to Michael Brooks. And when I do criticize him, I get tons of people who attack me now as if what I said is false. But no singular personality papers over the differences in both our internal and external worlds, the differences in the dialogues and the material history that produces the dialogues. Sometimes someone will critique me, and I hope they do it on good grounds and not just to protect their own ego. It's necessary to do. So as I think of Fisher, whose two works that I consider moving, sit with me. I think of Hauntology, of reading Spectres of Marx as an undergrad in a philosophy class around the alter globalization movement. The dialectics of reaction and non-reaction is interesting. I mean, the 90s was in many ways a reactionary time, despite the fact that the Democrats were in charge. Culturally, you can go back and look. Compare the 90s to the 70s, a more decadent and fecund time, but with a more mystified politics. In some ways, they rhyme. And history is often like a rhyming dictionary. I wish I had an easy lesson for you about the politics of joy. And maybe I do. You're not going back. If you want to build the things, you want to build the policies, you want to build the politics, you want to build class independence, give up trying to replicate the past. Most of it failed, and even what didn't fail has changed with history. What did not fail will only get you so far because you are not in that context. And the pressure of that is overwhelming. The demands of that freedom is overwhelming, not just for the individual, but even for the collective. What that requires of you personally is overwhelming. To be a good comrade requires discipline, requires social hygiene, requires education and self-innovation. You have to take care of yourself so that you can take care of others. A person too sickly to do that can't do it. And we will all eventually be that sickly. Trust me, these days, I know. I'm going to read a little bit of Bakhtin about Lucius, actually, which is a poet. He's commenting on the golden ass. But I think it will help you understand a few things that I'm trying to get at here in this vague way. This is from Forms of Time and Chronotope in the novel, in the book The Dialogic Imagination, for essays by M.M. Bakhtin. High point of Soviet literary criticism, I may add, some of the best. The most characteristic thing about this novel is the way in which it fuses the course of an individual's life at its major turning points with the actual spatial course or road. That is, with his wanderings. This is a picaresque novel, an early one, Roman. Thus is realized the metaphor, the path of life. The path itself extends through familiar, native territory, in which there is nothing exotic, alien, or strange. The unique novelistic chronotope is created, one that has played an enormous role in the history of the genre, and at its heart is folklore. Various means for realizing metaphor, the path of life, play a large role in all aspects of folklore. One can even go as far as to say that in folklore a road is almost never merely a road, but always suggests the whole or a portion of a path of life. The choice of real itinerary equals the choice of the path of life. An intersection always signifies some turning point in the life of the folklore character, setting out the road from one's birthplace, returning home, or usually the plateaus of age in the life of the individual. He sets out as youth, returns a man. Road markers are indicators of his fate, and so on. Thus, the novelistic chronotope of the road is specific, organic, and deeply infused with folklore motifs. An individual's movement through space, his pilgrimage, lose that abstract and technical character that they had in Greek romance, where it was merely mannered enchaining of coordinates, both spatial, near, far, and temporal, at the same time or at different times. Space becomes more concrete and saturated with time that is more substantial. Space is filled with real, living meaning and forms a crucial relationship with the hero and his fate. This type of space so saturates the new chronotope that such events such as meeting, separation, collision, escape, and so forth take on a new and markedly more concrete chronotopic significance. The concrete of the chronotope of the road permits everyday life to be realized within it, but this life, so to speak, spread out along the edges of the road itself and along the side roads. The main protagonist and major turning points of his life are to be found outside everyday life. He merely observes this life, meddles in it now and then as an alien force. He occasionally even dons a common and everyday mask, but in essence, he does not participate in this life and is not determined by it. The hero experiences events that are exclusively extraordinary, defined by the sequence of guilt, retribution, redemption, and blessedness. Such was the experience of Lucius. But in passing from retribution to redemption, that is precisely during the process of metamorphosis, Lucius most descended to the low, everyday life, and he must play the most humiliating role in that setting, not even the role of the slave, but that of an ass. As an ass, a beast of burden, he descends to the very depths of common life, life among them, the muleteers, hauling a millstone for the miller, servant and gardener, a soldier, a cook, a baker. He suffers constant beatings and is persecuted by shrewdest wives, the muleteer's wife, the baker's wife. But all these situations, Lucius performs not just Lucius, but an ass. At the end of the novel, he casts off the appearance of an ass and in a triumphant ceremony re-enters the highest, most privileged bit of life, outside the ordinary, everyday life, which coincides with his presumed death. His family's considered him dead. And of leaving that life is his resurrection. An ancient folkloric core of Lucius's metamorphosis is in fact precisely death, the passage to the nether regions and resurrections. In this instance, everyday life corresponds to the nether regions and to the grave. Corresponding mythological equivalents might be found for all the narrative motifs in The Golden Ass. So that's a good book, by the way. You should read it. I'll get to how this is relevant in a second, I promise. The stance of the hero vis-a-vis everyday life is a distance feature of the second type of the ancient novel, and one of extreme importance. This feature is preserved, although, of course, with variations throughout the entire subsequent history of the type. It is always the case that the hero cannot, by its very nature, be part of everyday life. He passes through such life as would a man from another world. Most often the hero is a rogue, a man who changes his everyday personalities as he pleases and who occupies no fixed place in everyday life. He plays life and does not take it seriously. The hero might also be a wandering actor disguised as an aristocrat or a high-born gentleman ignorant of his lineage family. Everyday life is the lowest sphere of existence from which the hero tries to liberate himself and with which he will never eternally fuse himself. The course of his life is uncommon, outside of everyday life, and one of stages, just as they happen through the progression through the everyday sphere. Playing the lowest role in the lowest level of society, Lucius does not participate internally in the life and is therefore an even better position to observe it and study all of its secrets. For him, it is the experience of studying and understanding human beings. I myself, says Lucius, remember my sojourn as an ass with great gratitude, for having suffered the turns of fate under the cover of an animal skin, I have become, if not wiser, at least more experienced. The position of an ass is particularly convenient for observing the secrets of everyday life. The presence of an ass embarrasses no one. All open up completely. Quote, and in my oppression, life only one consolation remained to me, to indulge in the curiosity with my native bent, since people never took my presence into consideration and talked and acted freely as they wished. The Golden Ass, Book 9. The ass has an additional advantage in this respect, his ears. Quote, and I, although distraught at the fatalist mistake, which had turned me into an ass instead of a bird, found the consolation in my pathetic transformation, in fact, this alone, that thanks to my huge ears I could hear excellently, even those things that happened far away. Book 9, The Golden Ass. This extraordinary positioning of an ass in the novel is a feature of extreme importance. The everyday life which Lucius observes and studies is exclusively personal and private life, but its very nature, therefore, can be nothing public about it. All the events are the personal affairs of isolated people. They could not concur in the eyes of the world. They could not occur in the eyes of the world publicly in the presence of a chorus. These events are not liable to public reckoning on an open space or an open square. Events acquire public significance only as they become crimes. The criminal act is the moment that private life becomes, as it were, involuntarily public. The remainder of this life is made up of the bedroom secrets, infidelities on the part of shrewish wives, husbands, impotence, and so forth, secret profiteering, petty everyday frauds, etc. And by its very nature, this private life does not create a space for the contemplative man, for the third person who might be in the position to mediate on this life, to judge and evaluate it. This life takes place between four walls and is only for two pairs of ears. On the other hand, public life, any event that has any social significance, tends towards making itself public naturally presuming an observer, a judge, an evaluator, and a place always created for such a person in the event that he is in fact an indispensable and obligatory participant in the event. The public man always lives and acts in the world, and each moment of his life, in principle and in essence, will avail himself to be made public. Public life and public man are by their very essence it's open, visible, and audible. Public life adopts the most varied means for making itself public and accounting for itself, as does its literature. Therefore, in particular positioning of a person who could observe or eavesdrop on this life, a third person presents no special problem, nor does the particular forms necessary for making it public. For this reason, the problem is not unknown in classical ancient literature, which was a literature of public life and of public men. See the Odyssey, see the great plays in the Greeks, see early Roman theater. But when the private individual and private life entered literature in the Hellenistic era, those problems inevitably were bound to arise. A contradiction developed between the public nature of the literary form and the private nature of its contents. The process of working out private genres began, but this process remained incomplete in ancient times. This problem is especially critical in the connection with larger epic forms, the major epic. In the process of resolving this problem, the ancient novel emerged. The quintessentially private life that entered the novel at this time was by its very nature, and as opposed to public life, closed. In essence, one could spy and eavesdrop on it. The literature of private life is essentially a literature of snooping about, of overhearing how others live. This life may be exposed and made public by criminal trial, either directly by Inserting the trial into the novel, along with searches and investigations, by inserting criminal activities into private life, are circumstantially and conditionally in a half-hidden way by utilizing eyewitness accounts, confessions of the accused, court documents, evidence, investigation, hunches, and so forth. And finally, we encounter these forms of self-realization that occur in the ordinary course of our everyday lives: the personal letter, the intimate diary, the confession, the early forms of the modern novel, by the way. If you've ever read epistolary novels in English from, the 15th century forward, that's what they are. We've already seen how the Greek romance resolved this problem, portraying personal life and private individual. It has tried to fit the context of the private life into an external, inadequate public and rhetorical forms that were, by the time, already stiff and dead. This was possibly only in the context of the Greek adventure time and the extreme abstractness to which it was portrayed. In addition, such a rhetorical basis, the Greek romance is introduced, as well as a criminal trial, something that plays a crucial role in the novel. The Greek romance also frequently makes use of everyday forms, such as the epistle. In the subsequent history of the novel, the criminal trial and direct and liberate forms, and the legal criminal categories in which we have an enormous organizational significance. Crimes play a correspondingly huge and significant role in the actual content of such novels. Various forms and writers of the novel make use of these manifold legal and criminal categories in different ways. It suffices to mention, on one hand, the adventure detective novel of investigation crews piecing together events that help those clues, and on the other hand, the novels of Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment, and the brothers Karamazov. The significance of legal criminal categories in the novel and the various ways they're used are specific forms of uncovering and making private life public is an interesting and important problem in the history of the novel. I say this and read this for 15 minutes for you to hear something. That even our ways of understanding and articulating this are rooted in the development of genre and technologies. And those voices are limited. How much we can show the public in private. But for us today, this is very confused. After all, we all make a brand of our private life if we engage in social media. And the blurring between public self and private self is completely blurred. The authentic is what we play at in showing the private. But when we approach someone like Mark Fisher or these histories, we can either overly privatize them, pretending that they are reducible to the lives of their authors, and thus not relevant to us, or we can pretend that we can resurrect them whole cloth out of nothing, and in that find some joy. And listening to people talk about Fisher, it is always how much of his context is forgotten. The cultural blogging was about the culture of the aughts, not ours. The Vampire Castle was about people critiquing an early Russell Brand, not the social democratic movement, and not just identitarian politics, which are mentioned in it as vampires, but that wasn't even only or the primary thing Fisher was concerned about. In many ways, Fisher was, if we were to read his other work, responding to his earlier work himself and separating himself from himself so that he could castigate himself without getting into the personal. And given what he was going through, his personal struggles were made public, but not to the extent that they can be fully understood by the public. Most of us also know that alienated people are alienating. But we have to look at this as the alienation makes us able to see. After all, it is easier to see what is going on between two people when you are not one of the people involved. Your eyes point out, as my teacher used to say. Which means this distortion of the public and private and the personal and political really makes it hard to understand what is driving people's politics today. Is it material consequences? Is it the algorithm? Is it the responses of their own prior failures? It is overdetermined. You and I cannot figure it out, but it is probably safe to assume that all of it is at play. Hauntology, the past approaching us as ghosts, nostalgia for times we never lived in, for the Fordism that none of us were born in, but have only read about, for the early Bolshevism, for the heroic struggles of the Popular Front during World War II, for fighting fascism. All of it can be approached as a form of hauntology, of wanting the heroic narrative, wanting to get rid of the burden of the private, wanting to be a part of material history, wanting not to be the ass. But you are. So am I. And as that blurring of the public and private begins, as I mentioned here, this is an exercise in blurring the public and private. After all, it was a private event in my private life that triggered me to think about this, to confront this yet again politics of joy, although more vapid and empty than the prior times it's come about. I've always said joy must be made of sterner stuff, and people think, and I mean hard edge people, that hope is for strong men, big men, men. Hope is for anyone, but it must be made of sterner stuff, not ghosts. You are never going back again. It's time to move forward. You know history as a way to learn how to navigate your sails, not to repeat it. And not just to not repeat it, as certain things will happen regardless of what you do and how much we teach you. Education is only a small part of this equation. But it is a part, and I hope you take something from this. You're never going back again. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. You can find more on the Patreon for as little as $3. Leave a comment if this meant anything to you. Leave a comment if you hate me, I'll ignore it, but you know, whatever. Keep your peace, because you're going to need it. If you want joy, you have to build it of real things, not imagined ghosts.